right, before I read 2C, which is polycentric and emergent societal order, can you just define polycentric and emergent societal order?
Well, um, to the so the word polycentric has been used in other ways, but I think it's a good word for coordinating with sphere sovereignty. So if you can actually think of spheres or circles or something and realize that each kind of community being a different sphere, that society in part in its communal relations exists not just as one circle, but as many different circles, right? These are different communities, different kinds of communities are these different spheres. And so the polycentric nature, the polycentric order of society is to contain these differentiated kinds of societal communities. So that's the polycentric aspect. And so each sphere has its own center of societal life. And the emergent aspect is that the order that develops in a society that has all these different communal relations, as well as inter-individual relations and intercommunal relations, the order that develops emerges from those kinds of relations operating normatively themselves, not from any kind of predetermined or externally imposed coercive order. It's an emergent order.
All right. Thanks for doing that. Now let me read this, the paragraph here. Society is normatively ordered and governed polycentrically, that is, within a variety of relations and particular communities of different kinds. A political order or community/institutions of civil governance does not have a task of comprehensively regulating society. Rather, the God-given task of civil governance is exclusively limited to administration of civil justice. The broader polycentric societal complex is coordinated emergently through the self-governance of each instance of varieties of relations and each particular community of the several distinct kinds. By God's creational design, a dynamic societal harmonization comes about cumulatively through the varieties of normative human action, but apart from any human individuals or communities' specific intention or attempt at comprehensive coercive regulation. Any attempt at coercive regulation of society overall violates the nature of society, the various norms and relations, and the distinct kinds of community within differentiated and limited authority ordained by God, and so introduces wide-ranging distortions and disorder. So that's a lot. So as Reformed people, we believe in God's providence. It's in our catechisms that we teach ourselves and teach our children. So how would you distinguish emergent spontaneous order from God's providence? And if so, if you would make that distinction at all, if you would, what's the difference?
Yeah. So I should have mentioned, you bring it up. That's what in the literature is often called spontaneous order, right?
Right.
So, and I'm referring to as a polycentric and emergent societal order. This is a normative design by God. So remember, we're talking about the difference between laws and norms. The difference between laws and norms is that norms can be broken. So that's what we're saying. This is a normative design. It can be disrupted and distorted in varying degrees or extent by violating God's norms, especially by coercive state interference. But in contrast, so just to contrast that with providence, God's providence is his, as the confession says, his upholding, directing, disposing, and governing all creatures, actions, and things from the greatest even to the least, according to the nature of secondary causes by the immutable counsel of his own will, whereby from all eternity he determines whatsoever comes to pass. So what that means is that everything that happens is, God's bringing that about through his providence. It can, God's providence is everything that happens and includes even human violations of how he normed society to properly function. So the polycentric and emergent societal order is a normative framework for how it's supposed to function and will, if more or less within following God's norms for societal order, this order emerges. There's a harmony, a functioning within society that's not imposed by the state. That happens. Whereas providence it isn't something that you can violate. You can't violate God's providence.
Right.
It's everything he brings about.
Right.
Yeah.
But even in God's bad things happen in God's providence, and God providentially works all those things together, for the good of those who love Him. And
that's correct. That's right.
Even all the evil that's done in the world is still, basically a footstool for God's, ultimate will. And so, are we really just talking about the same thing in two different terms? We're talking, one theological, philosophical terms, and another in more societal and economic terms. I mean,
well, it's another way to distinguish it. Sometimes we talk about God's eternal decree as his will, right? So his decretive will, and that's whatever comes to pass, and that involves sin, though God is not guilty or the author of sin. So his will in the sense of his decree, and then his revealed will in terms of his moral will, what he says you should do, right? And so It's like that. It's not a emergent societal order is not entirely a moral category, but it is a normative category. And so it's more like that. It's like how society can and should function in an orderly fashion without chaos and distortion. And that's like a moral law. But God's decree is whatever he brings about in history. So it's very similar to that distinction.